Hi, and welcome to Wild Birds of the Upper Valley. My name is Sheridan Brown. I'm an attorney from Grantham and involved with conservation law and legislative advocacy. I've also been a volunteer for a number of years with New Hampshire Audubon. So it's my pleasure today to be speaking with a friend of mine from there, Dr. Pam Hunt, who is their senior conservation biologist working in avian conservation. So we're talking today about chimney swifts and their decline in the area. And you've shown us some charts dealing with the population declines. And I'm just wondering, have they disappeared from anywhere?
That's a good question. If you look at the really broad scale, they haven't. But what a lot of states have done in the Northeast in particular and in Eastern Canada over the last 5-10 years is redoing something called the breeding bird atlas, which is basically they take the entire state or province and it's divided up in little squares, and they have people go out to those squares and record all the birds they can find and see if they're breeding on them or not. And these were originally done back in the late 70s, early 80s in most of the Northeast, including Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts and all the other states around. And they've just finished redoing them in the early 2000s. So you can use those two comparisons to say, look, there are no longer whippoorwills, for example, anywhere in northern New Hampshire or northeastern Vermont or whatever the species is. So in addition to seeing actual physical number declines, you can actually see what we call range retractions, where birds are no longer found where they are. For chimney swifts, we've seen not anything really dramatic like that. What we've seen are thinning of ranges. And there's actually, I've got a little visual thing here. This is Vermont. Vermont's first atlas was in the late 70s, the second atlas in the early 2000s. And it might not be easy to see, but there's red dots for where there were chimney swifts in the first one and not in the second one. Blue dots are where they were in the second one and not in the first one. And grays are where they were in both. And there's a whole lot more red dots than blue dots. And if you look at all that together, there was an overall loss of 26% of those areas that were occupied in the 70s are no longer occupied. And you look at the same thing for Maritime Canada, 38%, Ontario, 37%, New York, 16%, Delaware, 60%. That one's pretty scary. And then a little less in Massachusetts, actually went up in Massachusetts for some reason. So the actual overall range is about the same, but within a state, there'll be fewer places where they're going to be found. Right. And, that's like the first step where something's going to become rare at some edge. And probably the northern edge of the range where the declines are stronger in Canada, they will start pulling south as that progresses. So that's another indicator of how some of these population declines are going like that.
Well, that map is certainly very, very striking, and when I see that time frame, I think a lot of people would associate that with a period that might have been better for swifts because of banning DDT, and has that had any benefit to the swift population?
It certainly can't have hurt. Obviously DDT killed lots of insects. Insects population went down, bird population went down. DDT was also directly toxic to things now and then. We don't know exactly whether it affected swifts. But there was a very cool study done in Canada very recently in the last 5 years looking at changes in swift diet over time. And you might wonder, how can you do that? Right. Well, the answer is you find a place where there is a huge deposit of chimney swift guano or chimney swift poop. And basically, this old chimney where chimney swifts would roost, I think it was near somewhere in Ontario, and it had a 2-meter, 6-foot layer of old chimney swift poop. Wow. So taller than anybody, in this room. Right. And they were able to sample that layers to see what the composition of insect parts in the guano was, so they could tell what the chimney swifts were eating at various points in time. They could also sample it for residues from DDT, which is very expensive, so they didn't sample a whole lot of points for that. But they could also sample it for cesium, which is a radioactive element that they used to date it because cesium was a byproduct of atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. And you could tell when that stopped in the atmosphere, they knew that was that year, whatever year it was. I can't remember off the top of my head. So you actually could fix the date. It's like kind of doing a tree ring thing with the guano poop layer, which is redundant. So they actually got this whole layer. They were able to sort samples of it and look at the proportion of insects and when DDT was there and whatnot. And the cool thing that they found was early on in the sample, so before the DDT era, which kind of started in the 50s, the dominant prey items in the poop were beetle parts. So heavy, large beetle wing cases and things. And then it shifted rather dramatically, and beetles went down, and bugs, true bugs, like leafhoppers and stink bugs, things like that, started going up. And the theory behind that was that the beetles tend to be higher on the food chain, they're predators, and so they were disproportionately affected by DT. They got less common, and the bugs that were their prey increased, and swifts were eating fewer beetles because there were fewer beetles there, and more bugs. Now, whether or not that had an effect on Chimney Swift populations, we don't know, but certainly the timing of it is similar to when this whole decline's been going on. We don't have data from Chimney Swift numbers back when the study data collected because we didn't have surveys before '66. Right. But that shift in the type of prey they're eating clearly could be important, and we don't know whether it had an effect or not. DDT was then banned in the '70s, and those insect populations kind of started returning to what they had been. And the swifts continued to decline, so it's not beautiful smoking gun thing going on. It's a possible factor that caused a decline that they haven't recovered from some other reason, all those other reasons we were talking about. Right. So who knows? But it's a very cool bit of data. And that guy's looking for other chimney deposits. If it's a big chimney with tons of swift poop in it, let us know, and we can try to get some samples and get them analyzed. It'd be kind of fun to see what's happening in the U.S. because most of it's going on in Canada right now.
So. We've been talking about what swifts eat. When the chimney swifts are migrating, do they stop for food anywhere? Do they need to rest and refuel, or what's their pattern? Do they fly straight through?
They don't fly straight through. At least chimney swifts don't. We'll get to that in a sec. But they'll fly all day or into the night a little bit. They stop to roost communally in these big chimneys or hollow trees, and they gather there for night, rest overnight, keep themselves warm, especially if it's late in the season, and then get up the next morning, and if the weather's good, they'll keep flying. And they eat entirely on the wing when they're doing this, so they're feeding as they go, and then they rest overnight and feed again as they fly south. And that whole trip, from here to Brazil or Peru, wherever, could be 3,000 or 4,000 miles, and we don't have no idea how far they go in a night. No one's tracked an individual chimney swift, but it probably takes them a month. A lot of other small birds take 3 or 5 weeks to do that kind of similar route. Chimney swift's probably a little faster because they're flying consistently. Most little songbirds will fly for a couple hours, they'll land, they'll fly a couple more hours, or they'll rest. So chimney swifts are going boom, and probably covering a lot faster. But I mentioned before, there's another species of swift in Europe called the alpine swift, which is a bigger swift. It's probably 2 ounces instead of 1 ounce. And some tracking devices were added, some tracking devices were attached to those birds so they could recover the bird, take the data off the tracking device, determine where the bird was and what it was doing over the course of the time that the device was attached. And they found that some of these alpine swifts were in the air, nonstop flying for 200 days. Wow. 6 months, half a year, basically, a little more than half a year of flying. They did not land that entire time. So unlike our chimney swifts, which probably do land fairly often, these things were just constantly flying and foraging and probably sleeping, partially sleeping in the air.
That's amazing.
Which is kind of mind-boggling. Don't try that at home. Which really makes chimney swifts probably, swifts in general, the most aerial of birds. We think bird flight is cool, flight characterizes birds. Well, chimney swifts, or swifts, again, I should say, are the most aerial of birds. So they're the epitome of flight as far as birds go. They're not exactly glamorous when they do it. They're not soaring like hawks and things like that, but they're just flying a lot. A huge portion of their lives is spent in flight. And they're so well adapted for that they actually can't perch like regular songbirds or chickadees at your brood feeder or whatever. Their feet are set up so they really just can kind of cling onto things and hold on vertically, almost like little Velcro. Yeah. They can't perch on a branch and do this. Their feet just go get the little claws into the cracks in a brick or chimney or whatever and just hang there. And when they fly, they just fly out and go from there. So they don't even really, the only time they land, they're just sort of stuck onto a wall. Yeah. So
their landing gear's up all the time, pretty much.
Yes.
If these were a plane. The tracking devices that they put on these, that's very interesting because it must be a very small device,
Yeah.
obviously. And how do they go about getting these birds to put it on there? If you're talking about a bird that's flying most of the time.
Well, they
what's
catch them at the roosts. So you put a, people have caught lots of chimney swifts, and it's very easy. You put a net at the very top of a chimney, and they come out in the morning, and you catch a bunch, and then you can start banding them so you can see where they go, or you can put these tracking devices on. And, they have to be the tracking device has to be really, really tiny. We're talking, less than a gram.
Right.
Or the big swift, like an alpine swift, probably could be about a gram, which is incredibly small.
Right. And through those sort of banding efforts, do they have any sense of what the oldest chimney swift out there might be? Have they recovered any?
Yeah, apparently the oldest chimney swift on record is 14 years old.
Wow.
Which is pretty impressive. That means that bird flew back and forth the Amazon basin 14 times or more. If it was banded as a chick, it could have been 14. If it was banded as an adult, it could be 14 plus how old it was when they caught it. Right. So, which is pretty impressive. Most small birds, the average lifespan of chimney swift is probably a lot lower, but the maximum lifespans for things like warblers that are migrating, are closer to 8 or 10 years. Most birds don't survive more than 5. So, that was a very stupendous swift.
Yeah, that is an amazing journey to make that many times.
Methuselah of the swifts.
Once the birds get here, they're coming here to mate, to breed, to have babies. What are some of the mating habits of the chimney swift? Do they have same partner for life? Or?
Probably. We don't know. People do a lot of genetics on them, but they're what we call socially monogamous. So the male and the female be together. They'll both take care of the young when the young hatch and feed them. Speaking of the whole birds are incredibly aerial. These birds mate in the air. They don't land and do anything like most birds do, most other organisms do. So the male female will mate. They have a really cool courtship display where they kind of almost like they're spooning. They're just flying down in synchrony, twittering, so just following each other's moves, kind of like that, which is pretty cool. So that's part of their courtship display. Once that's all done, they build their nests, which are basically piles of sticks that are glued together with the bird's saliva. It's like really sticky spit. So they pick these little sticks up while flying with their feet. So their feet have 2 uses. One is to hold onto a chimney. One is to pick up sticks for nests. And they pile these little sticks in. They make a little sort of dish, half of a cereal bowl type thing, a couple inches across. Glue it together with their spit to the wall of the chimney. And that's their nest. It's amazing that they hold up. It rains in the chimney, and of course the chimneys, they usually nest far enough down the chimney that they're not going to get hit by the rain. So the rain, unless it was coming straight down torrentially, is not going to be a big problem because it's going to hit higher up. So they built that little nest. They lay, roughly 3 to 5 eggs, and the female will sit on those eggs for 2.5 to 3 weeks. This is all kind of starting in late May into June. And once those eggs hatch, then they'll both start feeding the little swiftlets. And again, it'll be another couple of weeks, 2.5 weeks before those young can fly. And then they don't, they have to fly right away. They're not like you may have seen, young ducks or even young herons and hawks or larger birds practicing flying. Well, if a swift doesn't get flying right the first time, it's going to be in trouble. It's going to be at the wrong end of the chimney and, not with the other ones.
Yeah.
So and then they spend another. So that's if it's 2.5 weeks for incubation, another couple and a half weeks for. So we're talking a month and a half roughly for the whole from getting the egg started to the young leaving the nest. Wow. And if they're lucky, they get them off. If they're far enough south in the breeding range, so down Carolinas or something, Texas, they could potentially have a second brood. Most of them up here, there's not time for that. Right. And if something happens to nest early, they'll re-nest. But usually up here, they'll just have one brood. So that's the sort of the home life of swifts.
Okay. And has anybody managed to capture this on tape? I know now we've got a lot of webcams and whatnot that
Swift
people put
cam.
on these things. I mean, it seems remarkable that they would just be able to build this nest while not being able to perch anywhere. Are they hovering and?
Well, they're doing the little clinging onto the thing. So they'll land on the side of the chimney, with the little stick and stick it there and then spit on it and whether anybody taken video of that, I don't know. That'd be a fun thing for anybody in the audience to Google.
Yeah,
and I'm sure if there's one out there, you'll find it. There are some really good videos of swifts going into the chimneys, which are pretty cool to watch. So maybe we'll get one of those on, get it right so we can stick it on here or put a link on it at some point anyway, because it's really phenomenal stuff to watch. Just chimneys, looking down a chimney at a bunch of swifts that are all kind of clustering in there.
And as they're gluing this nest to the side of the chimney, it's not the cleanest place in the world. They're not impacted at all by the creosote that's in there.
As far as we know, they've been nesting in chimneys since we started building chimneys, and so if anything, there's less nasty stuff in chimneys now than there was in the 1800s. Especially think about the Industrial Revolution. There was all sorts of really nasty stuff in there, and they seem to be fine. Luckily, they're not. They just build a nest there. They're not licking the chimneys or anything. So they're just living in there, and if there's any fumes or something, apparently they're not having a dramatic negative effect. So that's the one piece of good news, is that, these old factory chimneys and stuff don't seem to be a problem.
Right. Excellent.
Just too much creosote, I suppose, would fall off and the nest would go with it. But that's why that's why chimney sweeps are helpful.
As long as you're clean outside the breeding season. What's a single chimney swift to do with their life? Do they just have a vacation for the whole mating season?
No, they're desperate for mates, obviously, just like singles, anything are. Yeah. They'll, it's probably pretty rare. No one's really studied it in depth. But we do know that, there may be a pair of chimney swifts in their chimney. They don't like anybody else in there. So they're not super territorial when it comes to the bigger scale of things, but they don't want to share their chimney with somebody else unless it's a huge chimney, in which case you can probably get a couple in there. So unmated swifts will be poking around. They will roost occasionally during the day. So if they're not mating, they still want to take a nap, and so they'll find a place to roost. And if they end up roosting in a nesting chimney, the nesting swifts aren't going to be worried about that. They just don't want another nest in there. Yeah. So they'll just spend the summer poking around, hoping to maybe they'll see a mate they can hook up with next year, find a nesting site that's good for next year, keeping the future reproductive options on the radar the entire time. But if they're not breeding, they're just kind of out of luck.
Yeah. Do they ever pitch in, help out with the birds that have families?
Not that anybody knows. No. So there's a master's thesis for somebody.
Right. So some other aerial insectivores that are out there that you're studying that have these same declines going on.
As I said earlier, a huge proportion of these species are declining. In New Hampshire, in New England, I'll not be provincial here, there are 6 species of swallows. So we got purple martins, tree swallows, ruffling swallows, bank swallows, barn swallows, and cliff swallows. Of those, all but the ruffling swallow are declining. And if we think that chimney swift declines are bad, bank swallow and cliff swallow declines in the Northeast are exponentially declining. It's not that simple little line like this, it's going like this. And they've gotten really scarce. There used to be in the late 60s, maybe even in the early 90s to 70s, something like 30 purple martin colonies in New Hampshire, all mostly in the Lakes region and central part of the state. There are now 3 purple martin colonies in New Hampshire. Wow. Cliff swallows used to be far more common. Used to be cliff swallows nesting all over the place. There's a few colonies still in the Upper Valley that I know of, and they've disappeared. And the reasons for these declines for the swallows are probably similar to the declines for swifts. We don't know what's going on in the winter grounds. We don't know what's going on with the prey. They got the whole bad weather issues with, we know that affects purple martins. If there's a really bad spring cold snap, they will just abandon their nests and not come back. Even the next year, they might not come back. They just abandon the entire colony. They just got such a bad vibe from that year that they're going to say, okay, we're going to try nesting somewhere else. If they survive, the adults survive, and adults will die under those conditions. Because if they can't feed, they'll die. Right. So all of those swallows are declining most of the time, except for the ruffling swallow, which is increasing. So who knows what's going on with that? The funny thing about ruffling swallows compared to most of the other swallows is that they don't winter all the way to South America. They're spending the winter in Central America. So is there something different in Central America versus South America that's affecting these population trends? Other species that winter in Central America, with the flycatchers, which are also aerial insectivores. The flycatchers that go the farthest have the stronger decline. So things like eastern kingbird are declining very, very rapidly, whereas things like gray-crested flycatcher, which winters in the southeastern United States and northern Mexico, are hardly declining at all. So, is it the fact that they have to fly farther that makes them more vulnerable? Is it the fact that, they're coming back and they don't know what the weather's like, they come back to this bad weather and they get nailed? Or is it what's going on where they spend the winter? So there's all these possible explanations are kind of intermingled and hard to tease apart. But we're really at the beginning stages. You asked about other projects of figuring out how to separate these processes. We're trying to look at barn swallow colonies, kind of like what we're doing with Chimney Swifts. Where are they? Are the old ones still being used? And if not, can we look at data that says, well, this landscape is more developed than it used to be. There's less farm field or something, so there's less open areas to feed in. Who knows? But without the data saying where these things are and how many there are, it's hard to hone in on what the issues might be.
Right. And the recent story this week, not bird related, but there's been a lot of talk about the shrinking of the wintering habitat for monarch butterflies.
Yes, that was on the news this morning.
The illegal logging and the things that have had an impact. Is there a fair amount of that going on in South America and other places?
Certainly, South America has been the poster child for tropical deforestation in this hemisphere for a while. The interesting thing, again, we don't know where their habitats are in the winter, and given that they tend to be foraging in open areas. For all we know, actually clearing forests, and I'm not saying we should go cut down the Amazon, but openings in forest and sort of grassland areas might be better because they're birds that actually don't hang out in the deep forest. You don't go to the woods to look for swallows, right? You go to the fields or the farmland to look for swallows. So the wintering habitat, in the broadest sense, might be just fine. But what we don't know is what's going on in that habitat, whether there's insect population declines, or big monocultures with lots of pesticides that are just, if there's no food, So deforestation might not be as big a problem for some of these. We don't know. Flycatchers, maybe it is, but swallows, we don't. So there's so much we don't know about this problem. We just get to, think about, 30 years ago when everybody was trying to save eagles. We knew a lot about eagles, and we used that to save eagles. And now we're just we need to learn a lot of this stuff to know what we're going to do next. And a lot of it's going to be what we're trying to do is figure, what can we figure out? What can we learn that's easy to learn? First, the low-hanging fruit.
Right.
And then if that doesn't seem to be an answer, then we just have to try to figure out something else and have a big field trip to Brazil.
So this monitoring effort here in New England, New Hampshire, Vermont, could have a pretty significant impact on a national, maybe even global scale. If it leads to
if we identify pieces that are missing, like if we suddenly discover, wow, all the only places where they roost in migration are chimneys that are blah 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 blah, right. And then we find out that leads to another question. Okay, well, how many of those chimneys are there? You find out there's fewer of them, then you might have a piece of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're probably a few years out from getting some of those pieces sorted out, and there's people in Canada working on other things and. This is not just a New England, New Hampshire, and Vermont effort. Right. This is people scattered across, the eastern United States that are working on swifts and swallows in particular.
Right. And this question probably extends a little bit beyond aerial insectivores to other migrating birds, but are there things that we can do? Obviously, there's a little more in our control here on the New England end, but in the wintering habitat, are there things we can do through our consumer choices to help birds in other places, South America, Central America?
Yeah, one of the obvious ones, and people may have heard about this, is what kind of coffee you drink. And there's not a whole lot of other options right now, but the coffee issue, people have discovered, they've done lots of research on this, Smithsonian folks, that most coffee comes from what's called sun coffee, which is not the original version of coffee in the world, which normally grows in the understory of forest. And they bred it so you could big monocultures of coffee, you could herbicide it and fertilize it to all you need to get a bigger yields and so on. But that coffee is basically like a cornfield. It's just one monoculture of coffee that's not terribly good for anything other than coffee and maybe a couple of things that like to hang out in little coffee shrubs. But if you grow coffee in the shade, where it normally evolved, that habitat is still there for forest birds, both the migrants and the tropical birds that live there. So the tons of research has been saying, look, if you just grow shade coffee, you've got the canopy, the natural forest that's above it. Sometimes that's actually fruit trees that people use for other foods, and there's more birds there. And true coffee aficionados, which I am not one, often say that it tastes better too. Right. And it certainly has less chemical impacts on the local ecosystem. So that's the one thing, that's the main thing that's going on. People are working on trying to do that with chocolate now too. It hasn't got there. And all sorts of other sort of green local food sources, but the coffee is the big one, and send conservation money to buy land in Latin America. It's a lot cheaper than buying land in New Hampshire and Vermont,
right.
Which we've got a very good conservation record here, so we can sit on our laurels and try to connect the two pieces of the migration.
Well, I can vouch for the shade-grown coffee. I do think it tastes better.
A blind taste test on TV next week.
So that is certainly my little contribution to things on the wintering end, and I imagine probably other places like the co-ops around here have a good amount of shade-grown coffee.
It's actually bird-friendly coffee. It's certified by the Smithsonian.
Okay.
So there's a little logo with a bird. Birds and Beans sells it. There's a couple other places. Can't remember. I don't drink coffee, so I don't know.
And do I remember hearing something about Audubon selling that as well?
Yes, we sell it down in Concord.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think that concludes our second installment of Wild Birds of the Upper Valley. And again, we're really thankful to Pam for being here.
Having me.
And we hope we can get some people enlisted in this effort. And how do people reach you if they want to help with this monitoring effort?
The Chimney Swift monitoring is actually, we also have a swallow monitoring project. But yeah, you just use my email, which is phunt@nhaudubon.org.
Okay, fantastic. And I just want to also mention our blog that we have for this effort, which is Chimney Swift Task Force of New England.blogspot.com. That'll be up on the screen so people don't have to try and figure out what I just told them. But also the Twitter handle for this effort is at Chimney Swifts US. So a couple places where people can get more information as well as contacting you, which I hope they'll do so we can get this rolling.
Come on down and wait till May when stuff starts happening.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.